So let it be written, so let it be done. This is Tabletop Terrors, and today we're going to do Learn to Play D&D Video 6, Magic and Spellcasting. Many of you have asked us to do this particular video, and we are happy to jump in and teach you how to use magic in D&D. So the first thing that might seem really simple, but is like really important. Every spell that your character can use is written somewhere, either in this book or some of the other D&D books. But it's really important to remember two things. One, spells do what their description says. So there's not really any rhyme or reason. So going in, you might read one spell and it is really long. 3 paragraphs explaining all these different things that happen and that you can do. You might read another spell that's very, very short. That's just how it is. So just remember that everything you need to know about in-game, like the range of the spell and the shape and the effects, that's all written in the spell. So you also need to remember the second thing. You don't have to memorize that. Especially when it comes to like all the spells that you're going to be using. You're not a real wizard, Harry. Use the player's handbook, bookmark your spells, or have like D&D Beyond open or another online resource so that you can reference your spells. So going in, remember those two things, and things get a lot easier.
Yeah, so it's something that even I can say is like I've played a lot of spellcasters. Like I basically almost every character I make is a spellcaster when I play D&D or any game like this. And I've played them a lot across a lot of different systems. And like even still after all that, I will still keep an internet tab up with like my spell lists basically online. So if I need to double check what a spell does or what it can do, like there's no shame in like needing to like have resources on hand for that sort of thing. That's basically everyone who plays these classes, no matter how experienced they are, probably has at least a reference sheet somewhere for exactly how all this stuff works. And getting into, I think, actually making a spellcaster and sort of spellcasting in general, the most difficult part about the process is actually making the character, especially if you're not familiar with all the little intricacies of spellcasting. So once you actually have your character created and you've picked all your spells and you know which ones they are and what they do, like once you get to that point, it's much easier and much more manageable to actually play that character. So I know it seems very daunting at first to make a spellcaster instead of just a fighter or whatever. And there definitely is a little bit of a learning curve when it comes to like getting the full breadth of what spellcasting is, because there's a lot of information there. But hopefully we can explain some of that in an easy way. And again, once you get past that hurdle of I have my character, I've picked my spells, I know kind of approximately what they do, like you've gotten to the easy part in the process. So hopefully we can get there.
And I just wanted to jump in and say real quick that this is going to seem overly complicated, and I just want to say out loud that it kind of is. Each of the classes does things a little bit differently in a lot of different ways, and there's not necessarily any rhyme or reason. So I just want to say that to somebody learning it, that when I play a wizard, I go read over the wizard stuff again. When I play another spellcaster, I just go take a look real quick, because a lot of it you'll grasp, but there's just a few little intricacies for some of the classes that kind of don't make sense. And I just want to throw it out there that there's not something you're missing, some knowledge if you only had it'd be perfect. Sometimes it's just a little finicky, but once you're playing, like Jeff said, it kind of all that fades away.
Yeah, so kind of like what James is saying, just think of each spellcasting class interacting with magic in a way that makes sense for their story, thematically. And that's honestly just how I explain it to myself. It makes it easier to say, no, the wizard does things this way because it's wizardly, and the warlock does things this way because it's warlocky. And if you kind of think of it that way, every time you make a new character, you'll set yourself up to say, oh, how does this class use magic?
So one last note before we get into the specifics of exactly sort of how spellcasting works and trying to break that all down. I thought it would be worth saying that throughout this video, we're going to have to do a lot of caveating about specific classes and specific way that rules works. That's not even necessarily out of us trying to explain it or things not like being clear from us conveying it. just the way that the spellcasting system is built in 5e, for almost any rule that you can try to paint across the board as far as how spellcasting works, there's going to be at least one class where that's not true for them. So we're going to try our best to get the general, broadest sense out there, but just know that if we have to say it's like this usually, but not all the time because of this, like there's going to be a lot of that throughout this video. And as James said before, like if there's any confusion, you can always consult the specific class that you're playing to try to clear up how it does or doesn't work for them. But we're going to do our best to get the main system out there in the open. So with all that said, all the caveating about our caveats out there in the open already, let's kind of work through now the very basic level of spellcasting and how it works. So there are a couple things we can say across the board for all the classes. And that's, you will have spell slots, and you will have spells that you have access to, and you use those slots to cast those spells. So basically, when you make your character, it'll tell you there's a chart at the top of every class header that'll say exactly how many slots that class gets and for what level, and we'll talk about all that stuff, in more depth. But you'll have a certain number of slots that you can use basically between rests. And you can use one of those slots to cast a spell that you have access to. And when you cast that spell, that slot goes away until you rest, basically. And then you have spells that you know, and how you know them and how you learn them works differently for the different classes. And we'll talk about that again very soon. But that's just sort of the absolute highest possible level. Your character will have spell slots, which determines how many spells they can cast total between rests. And then you'll have specific spells that you have access to, and you can use those slots to cast one of those spells.
So continuing this sort of broad stroking, there are slight differences between how some of the classes get their spells and how other ones do. So starting with the Bard, the Sorcerer, the Ranger, and the Warlock, they know some of the spells from their list. As they level up, they can pick new ones, but those are the spells they know, and they can cast any of those spells using their spell slots. In contrast to that, some classes, the Clerics, Druids, and Paladins, they have to prepare their spells for the day. So they can choose from any of the spells, but every time they rest, they can go, they pick the ones they want that day. But similarly, they can choose to use their spell slots on any of the ones that they've prepared for that day.
So you'll notice we left a spellcasting class off the list there. This is caveat one of many, as we had mentioned before. So as James mentioned, some classes will just learn very certain spells, and they'll always have access to those spells as long as they have spell slots. Other classes know their full list, but have to prepare specific ones each time they rest. Wizards are exception to this rule specifically, where they both learn a limited number of spells from their list, and also have to prepare specific spells from the ones that they know. So it's a weird sort of exception to the rule, but just know that some classes will just know certain spells. Other classes will know all of them and have to prepare specific spells. Wizards will have to both know and prepare specific spells. So it's just a weird exception to kind of how those two groups work, but wizards have to do both.
And remember, you don't have to memorize any of this, but if you just remember these concepts, the most important part is when you make the character you're making, it will be described in that section. But what we're prepping you for is don't expect that if you make a cleric, oh, I'll just flip over to the bard and do that real quick. It's very different for each class. So that's now you have your expectations set there. Because there is no baseline, as Jeff, said, because there is not a through line, it was even difficult for us to come up with a clean analogy to explain these things. And so we're going to attempt one, maybe two analogies that even the analogies are caveated, but we want to explain it in a way that doesn't have to do with spells or spell casting. So bear with us here, and hopefully this will help you and not make it more confusing. All right, so let's give this a shot and see if this tracks. So, the Bard, the Sorcerer, the Ranger, and the Warlock, the ones that know some spells from their list, think of them as having an MP3 player. It's not hooked to the internet. So if they have, 5 songs in their library, that's what they have on their MP3 player, and they can listen to any of those 5 songs anytime they want. And as they level up, they can get more songs and put it in their library and use them. Okay, now this is where it's going to get caveat-y, even with the analogy, because we had to figure out something that worked. You're getting ready to go on a flight, and the flight is really long, and it doesn't have Wi-Fi. What these other classes get to do, so you have your clerics, druids, paladins, they have all their spells that they know, but they have to prepare some for the day. What this is like in the analogy is they know they're going on the trip, so they have to download the ones that they're going to want to listen to for the flight. And then, when they get to their layover and there's Wi-Fi again, for that long rest, they can jump back on and download other songs from Spotify, but they will only have access to the ones they downloaded. So hopefully that tracks and makes it at least a little more clear.
And then the Wizard has one of those old MP3 players back before the iPod was real big that has like some crazy operating system that they made in some other country. And so he only has the songs he's downloaded on his computer, but he can get more, right, if he buys them or gets them in some other way. But then he also has to put them on his old MP3 player with the weird operating system that isn't part of the analogy, but is very important to the story.
So with that analogy, to try to sort of set up the groundwork, I'm going to try to show some like very specific examples, like actually using the spell lists that these classes can have and sort of showing how the process is going to be different between these two categories of spellcasters. So I'm going to be doing the sorcerer and the cleric because those are both in opposite categories. So the first one I'll do is the sorcerer. So here's the sorcerer spell list. And sorcerer is at level 1, and this is all in all the character creation stuff. It'll say how many spells that they know. So sorcerers know 2 spells at level 1. So that means when I'm making my sorcerer, I can look at this first level spell list right here. And there's a whole bunch of different spells, a whole lot of options to pick from. And I'll leave it to you to look at which ones specifically do what and all that. We're not going to cover that, obviously, in this video. But I would basically pick 2 of these spells out of this list. So like, Burning Hands sounds pretty cool. I like that. Bunch of fire. Featherfall, a nice safety switch. So I'm going to pick those 2 spells. So basically, as long as I have spell slots, and as long as I know those spells, because they can change as you level up, I can cast any of those spells using my spell slots. So I have Burning Hands and I have Featherfall. So I can use my slots to cast those whenever I want to. As long as I have a slot, I can cast those spells. And when I level up, I will learn new spells that I get to add to that list. So you'll see a lot of options here, but you'll only pick certain ones that you'll have available to you. And then you can use those slots to cast those spells. Now, where this is different is when you go over to things like the cleric and the druid and the paladin, as we mentioned before. So that's going to be a little bit different. So the cleric is the list that I'm going to use here. So as a cleric, this first level list right here, all these different options, I know all of those spells, but I only get to have specific ones ready for the day. So when I make my character or whenever I take a long rest, I will choose a certain number of those to prepare. Now, the number that you'll be able to prepare will be slightly different based on what class you're playing, what your stats are usually factor into it. So I'm not going to say a specific number. But so when you finish a long rest, or when you make your character, you'll prepare a number of spells, and it'll tell you exactly how many spells that will be per class, and it'll change depending on your stats and things like that as well too. But you'll basically prepare a list across any level of spell that you have access to. You'll prepare up to the number that your class says that you're allowed to prepare. And then for those days, you can use your spell slots to cast the spells that you've prepared. Now, the difference here is when you rest as a cleric and you finish your long rest, you can change which ones you have prepared to any of the options on the list as long as it's a level that you are allowed to cast. So hopefully that helps sort of break down some of the differences between them, where classes like the sorcerer and the other ones on that list, you learn specific ones. You don't have to bother about preparing one or the other. You just know the ones that you know, but it'll be known from an incomplete list of what the entire list of spell options will say. Versus the clerics, you'll have all the options available, but you'll have to prepare specific ones each time you rest. And that can change, but you still have to select that, and you can only use slots on the ones you have prepared.
So we've talked a little bit about spells and a little bit about spell slots. Spells have different levels to them, just like characters can. Level 1, level 2, level 3. It's important to note they don't always correspond directly to character level. One more caveat for the list. But with that said, you have spell slots, and those correspond to a level of spell. So level 1 slots are for level 1 spells, and level 2 slots, and so on. You get it. It's important to note that a higher level spell slot can be used to cast a lower level spell, but not vice versa. So of course you could use a level 3 spot for a level 1 spell, but you couldn't cast a level 3 spell with using a level 1 slot. It simply doesn't work that way. But otherwise, you have a certain amount of slots per level, and you can use that many of that level spell. One more caveat. It's important to note that some spells, if they use a higher level slot, get some bonus, and that'll be denoted in the actual spell description. Just keep an eye on that, but it only happens occasionally.
So, some more analogies. So, in the first example that James used, where you could use a larger slot to cast a smaller spell, the way that Jeff and I were talking about it was like, if you had a $50 bill and bought something that was $20, you wouldn't get the change back. So you can use that $50, but you're basically buying something worth $20. But you couldn't flip that. I can't take a $20 bill and buy something that's worth $50. For the second thing James talked about, where you can cast spells as higher level spells using those slots, basically it's like if you're in line at Chipotle and you want them to add extra steak. You can basically just pay for that extra scoop of steak. You get to spend more, and the spell will do more.
So as James and Tim mentioned, spell slots is like basically this resource system, that you can spend those slots to cast spells, and you can use them for different levels depending on what slots you have available. Now, once you use a spell slot, it's gone and you cannot use it again. So you only have that limited number of them. But you can get those slots back. Now, again, exactly how you get those slots back is going to be different from class to class. The general rule for this one is if you take a long rest, you get all of your spell slots back. Now, there are certain classes where that's not the case. And so warlocks specifically, you get them back on a short rest instead of a long rest because they have less slots. Warlocks are kind of weird with the way that their slots work. And wizards have a class ability that lets them get some, but not all slots back on a short rest. So if you're playing one of those two classes, check, on those short rests to see what you might get back. But the general rule is long rest gets you all your spell slots back. Now you'll notice that there has been sort of one spell thing that you'll see on your character creation stuff when you're going through spellcasters that we have not touched on yet, and that is cantrips. So basically, cantrips are sort of their own exception to the rule of spell slots, where cantrips are a certain number of spells that you can basically pick from for each class. And you can cast cantrips as many times as you want. They don't use any spell slots to cast. So as long as you know a cantrip and you can cast a spell in that moment, you can use them as many times as you want in as many different circumstances as makes sense. So there's basically, because spellcasters have that limited resource of like what makes them powerful in D&D, those spells that can do big things but you run out of them, cantrips are basically a middle ground to say, hey, even if you've used up all your slots, you still have things that you can do as a spellcaster, and cantrips are basically the way to keep you using your magic and using what you're good at while not constraining your very delicate resource system of spell slots and the spells that you know and learn. Now, they are also a little bit different because cantrips, you will always pick certain cantrips from a list, no matter what class you are. So even if you're a cleric and you know all the spells on your list, cantrips, you'll still only pick however many cantrips you know, and it'll tell you on your class list at what level you know how many cantrips. It'll always be a matter of selecting cantrips from the list based on how many you know, never that you get the whole list and prepare them. They're always automatically prepared. You can always cast them whenever, but you only get the certain ones that you pick from the list. And that is a universally across the board thing for all the classes. Cantrips always work this way. One more quick note on cantrips is that certain cantrips, especially ones that deal damage, will deal different damage or have slightly different effects depending on what level your character is. So even though the cantrip itself doesn't use any spell slots, it might still get stronger depending on what level you are. So just when you pick your specific cantrips, keep an eye out. There will be something in the description of the spell that'll say, the damage increases to this at this level and so on. And that'll obviously be different for all the different cantrips and all the different scenarios. But just something to keep an eye out for, that it doesn't use a slot, but it might still do more depending on what level you are. So just a note to watch out for when you're picking your cantrips.
So, time for another analogy. Consider cantrips as being like that very basic weapon you get in a first-person shooter that can never run out of bullets. It's so that the spellcaster generally is never unarmed with what they're supposed to be good at, which is magic. So it's like having that very low level, like it's not so damaging and so powerful that casting it multiple times is going to change the game drastically. So that's a lot of the basics of character creation and how the spell slots and choosing your spells matters when you're writing it all on the sheet. And so now let's go into actually using the magic that you wrote on your sheet. And that's what we're going to transition into now. So there's not really a clean, simple way to transition into this. So we'll just start somewhere. Spell components. What are spell components? Think of them as the things you need to cast the spell. So in 5th edition, there are 3 types of components that a spell can have. Now, they don't have to have them, and they can have any combination of these. Verbal, which is like the words you're speaking, the magic you're speaking. Somatic, which is like the movement of your hands. And then material, which is, some cool thematic stuff that you can use, like ash from a bonfire and different things that are themed to it. So sometimes these matter, and sometimes, like in the games that I play, honestly, unless it's really important, we largely don't even track this stuff. Where it can be cool, and I'm going to give you some examples of why you might want to track it. So for verbal spells, if you're in a game scenario where the characters can't talk, like they're gagged, or, for whatever reason, there's a silent spell cast on them or whatever, that is kind of a cool limitation to where now you can't cast that spell unless you solve that problem. Same thing for somatic. If your hands are tied or if you're holding weapons and things like that, it kind of makes it more thematic where it's a limitation so that the spell just has more flavor and feels a little more grounded in the world. When you might want to track the material components is when there is a gold value associated with them. Most of the material components are sort of negligible. They seem like they would be very cheap, and so you can actually use something called an arcane focus or other things that the different classes get that basically let you ignore this. So rather than have that ash from a bonfire, if you have an arcane focus, this item you get at character creation, you can just ignore that. Where the arcane focus doesn't work is if the material components actually have a cost. And it'll say it next to the spell. Say like a diamond worth X amount of gold or whatever. Think of this The reason why this exists is so that you can't just go around casting these insanely high level spells and like spamming them. You would have to either pay the cost or have that material component, and the arcane focus is not going to let you bypass that diamond. So those are some reasons why you would use the components and how they're intended to be used.
So just to basically try to clarify, some of the things that Tim had mentioned there, I'm going to just go through 2 quick examples just to sort of show the difference, especially in the material components, sort of how that thing might work and why that limitation might be there. So I'm going to pull up 2 spells here, just at random because I know them and I know that they'll suit, the examples that I need to have. One of the spells is Lightning Bolt. So it's a level 3 spell. Just shoots a line of lightning, does some damage. That's not the important part. But the components that you'll be able to see here, so it says VSM. So that means verbal, somatic, material. So that means this spell uses all the different types of components. So as part of casting the spell, there's some words you have to say, there's some motions you have to do. And then there's the material, and it says a bit of fur and a rod of amber, crystal, or glass. Now, you can get those things if you want to use those to cast the spell, but as Tim mentioned, every class in 5e will start with either an arcane focus or a holy symbol, and that lets you bypass materials that don't have a gold value. You can see, even though it's saying amber, crystal, glass, that there's no actual gold piece of value here, so that lets you know that that's not something that you need to actually spend money, to get, as long as you have that focus or the holy symbol. You can just cast the spell as long as you have the spell slot. Whereas, if we go over to the spell Raise Dead, you'll see that this spell also has VSM, verbal, somatic, and material. But the main difference being that the material says a diamond worth at least 500 gold pieces, which the spell consumes. So that means the only way that you get to cast Raise Dead is if you have a diamond that's valued at that much gold pieces, and when you use the spell, that diamond goes away forever. So because this one does have a gold piece value, you do actually have to have that diamond to cast the spell. Now, as far as, why the system is the way that it is, just to sort of, I guess, try to help cement some of these things. Because you get your spell slots back every time you rest, and Raise Dead is just a spell with a 5th level spell slot, as long as you have that, you could theoretically, if you didn't have that limitation, you could bring somebody back from the dead every time you rested, which is insanely powerful to be able to do. So this is basically 5e's way of saying, while all spells have their spell levels, some things are exceptionally powerful even for the level that they're at. Now, they didn't want to make it super high level, so you can only Raise Dead if you're like 18th level, because it's a 9th level spell. They wanted to give people access lower down, but they didn't want people just to be able to use it every single time they rested. So this is kind of the middle ground point of there's that gold value, so you actually have to go out of your way to get those materials for things that are going to do things like bring people back from the dead, as opposed to just another damaging spell that's going to hurt enemies. So those are kind of 2 specific examples of how the components might work. Now, some spells might not have all of the components, so that's just something to keep out for when you're picking your spells as well. If it doesn't have that V, that means you don't actually have to say anything to cast the spell. So if you were in, like Tim said, if you were in a place where you couldn't talk at all, you could still cast a spell if you don't have the V symbol in that components. So just a couple things to look out for across the different spells and sort of why and how those things work the way that they do. So we mentioned a couple times, arcane focus and holy symbol lets you bypass material components, which is true. Now you'll see some classes will give you the option of an arcane focus or a component pouch. I just wanted to quickly say that mechanically speaking, those are functionally identical. That they basically say, if you have a component pouch, it basically just assumes you have all the materials you need for your spells in that pouch. It accomplishes the same purpose, which is basically to say, you don't actually have to go around in your character sheet and track the eyelash of a fly and the fur of a bat. It's just like those, you don't have to, keep track of things that specifically. As long as you have your pouch or your focus, they do the same thing, which is let you bypass materials with no gold piece value.
So some classes have the ability to cast some of their spells as rituals. And really what this does is it allows you to not have to use a spell slot on some spells that you still want to use and get use out of, but don't want to use one of your very few spell slots when you could use it later in combat. So any spell that is tagged as a ritual, you'll see this in the text of the spell when you look them up, can be casted. It takes 10 minutes, and it allows you to cast the spell. A good example for this is a spell like Speak with Animals. You could, spend 10 minutes doing everything it takes to talk to the bird that maybe saw the murder take place. You can do all this narratively while still putting in that 10 minutes, right? So you can't, just not use spell slots all the time, but you can also conserve your very precious spell slots for times when you want to use something like a fireball or a stronger spell.
So just as a note, when you cast a spell as a ritual, because it does not use a spell slot, that means you cannot cast that spell at a higher level. So if it's a spell that gains benefits from using a higher spell slot to cast it, if you cast it as a ritual, it's considered just cast at the level that it would normally be cast at if you use the appropriate slot for that level.
It's what's really ironic, everybody, is that I'm going to have to concentrate to tell you about this next confusing sort of thing, which is concentration. Certain spells narratively require, like, just imagine that they're so difficult. It's like holding the magic beam or holding the stasis, where it requires you to concentrate and focus your energy and you're pushing yourself. Mechanically speaking, some spells are so powerful and they have lasting effects that to have more than one of those going at the same time would be sort of game breaking. To be able to be doing like two very powerful things with magic. And so the way that is divided is some more powerful spell effects use concentration. So that's a tag. What that basically means is you can only have one spell you're concentrating on at a time. So as an example, if I have a spell that it's like, for this many minutes, these crazy spirit guardians fly around and attack every single round. If that spell says that it's concentration, I can cast other spells as long as they're not tagged concentration. So I might be able to do other smaller spells. I'm focusing. I've got these spirit guardians flying around, and then I might this small spell and this small spell. And so that is, again, it's in place to make sure that, the magic doesn't get overpowered. Couple of things. One, just because a spell has a concentration tag doesn't mean you have to concentrate on it. Some of them have like short-term one-round effects. So just bear that in mind, that just because it says concentration doesn't mean you have to concentrate on it. So if I'm using one spell that requires concentration and I have another one that has that tag, I could still use that, but only gain the immediate effects, not the concentration effects, right? Something else about concentration. Whenever you take damage and you're concentrating on a spell, you have to make a Constitution saving throw to maintain your concentration. Basically meaning you're focusing, and any harm befalls you, it could jar you out of that focus and end the spell. So that's another thing. So I'm going to try one more analogy about concentration. It doesn't matter if you have an MP3 player or Spotify and they're downloaded. You can only play one song at a time. And that doesn't exactly hold up, but please just bear with us. Pardon our dust as we try to explain this very complex system.
So just as last time, I followed up Tim's analogies with some specific game examples. I'm going to do the same thing here now, and just talk about concentration a little bit, and hopefully that'll help to clear it up. So again, I'm just picking spells at random that I know will sort of lock into what I'm talking about here. And there are a bunch of spells that will also all do this. So just again, you'll just look when you're picking your spells, or looking over what they do. It'll say in the duration whether or not it's concentration and for how long you can concentrate on it. The specific duration is not important to right now, but I'll give an example. So I have a spell here called Hold Person. Very good spell. It basically it prevents another enemy from acting, so you can basically paralyze them. They can't move or do anything. Now, that's a very powerful effect in 5e to just be able to completely neutralize one enemy over another. So, because of how powerful it is, it's a concentration spell. So, if I use Hold Person on one person, and it works, they fail the saving throw, so they're paralyzed. I can cast other spells that are not concentration spells while I'm still holding them paralyzed. But if I wanted to use Hold Person again on somebody else, I would not be able to have them both held at the same time because you can only have the one concentration spell going. So if I were to cast Hold Person again on somebody else, I would then have to pick which one I'm going to concentrate on. Do I keep that person held down, or do I switch it over to that person? And that goes for any spell with concentration. It doesn't have to be the same spell. So if I have a spell that, like Bless, for example, that gives me and allies a d4 that they can add to their rolls, that's, pretty good. It might get that roll, from missing into a hit. But, holding a person in place and stopping them from moving is also a pretty big thing. So that can be another situation where you have to decide. I have Bless, all my allies are getting that d4, but I really want to lock that guy down. I think it'd really help the battle. If I cast Hold Person and he fails the save, I then have to pick. Do I keep Bless going, or do I switch it to Hold Person? And you can let go of concentration, on whichever one you choose, which is just another side note about concentration. You can stop concentrating on a spell at any time for any reason. Doesn't use an action. It doesn't use any, game economy. If you're concentrating on a spell, you can choose to stop whenever you want to. And another spell, which can sort of tie in how Tim mentioned, some spells you can cast even if they're tagged concentration, that you don't have to continue to concentrate on them. And that's the spell Witch Bolt. So if you look at Witch Bolt here, basically you hit them with a bolt of lightning. And if you want to, you can basically keep the lightning on them and use your action each turn to continue to damage them. Now, it's tagged concentration here because you can keep concentrating on it if you want to. But if I had Hold Person paralyzing one person, and I say, I want to do that d12 of lightning damage with my Witch Bolt, but I don't want to stop my Hold Person, I could still cast Witch Bolt on the person. The immediate effect happens, which is I hit them and they do a d12 of lightning. And then I can just choose not to continue concentrating on Witch Bolt, let that go away, and keep concentrating on Hold Person instead anyways. So any tag that has concentration, you just have to take a look. Some of them it makes sense to cast anyways. Some of them it doesn't. Like if you cast Hold Person and immediately don't concentrate on it, you lose the spell. So getting into nitty gritty in terms of that sort of thing, but hopefully that sort of helps clear up kind of exactly how concentration works and when you do concentrate, when you don't, and sort of how balancing those spells works.
So we've talked a lot about the theory of spellcasting and the different classes and things like that. So we're going to start getting into more details about exactly how it works, but we just need to go over a few more things. Every spellcaster has one of the stats that they have that is their spellcasting ability. For the bard, for example, it's charisma, and for the other classes, it's different. This will be noted in each class. That is the spellcasting modifier that you will use for some of these things. You'll see what I mean in a moment. When a spell does an attack, when you're making a spell attack, just like you get to add your proficiency bonus plus whatever that spellcasting modifier is. And that decides what you add to your roll when you're making the attack. Alternatively, when you cast a spell and somebody has to try to maybe dodge to get out of the way of it or see if they avoid it, you have what's called your spell save DC. This is the number that this person has to roll over to avoid the effects of your spell. And this would be the 8 plus your proficiency bonus plus whatever that spellcasting modifier was. These things will be noted on your character sheet, and when they come up for the spells, you'll just look at that. But that's sort of how the spells will interact with combat and the world.
And it's worth noting, too, that those numbers will change as you level up and as your stats change. So, if, for example, if I'm playing a bard and my charisma score goes up so that my modifier jumps from a 4 to a 5 because I bumped my score up when I got to level 4, like that my spell attacks and my spell save DCs will go up with that. Or if my proficiency bonus increases, that those numbers will change. So just like all the other stuff with skills and attacks and stuff that we talked about in the character creation video, just know that those numbers will evolve as your character does. But those are at least the ways that they're derived. So it should be easy to figure out from there.
Yeah, and if you think about when we made the character, when we made a fighter, we talked about their melee weapon and their ranged weapon, and we calculated how hard they hit and how much damage they do. This is very similar, but how good you are at casting spells basically makes it so that you can hit more often, etc.
So similar to how a lot of the rest of this video is, we are getting to the point where we've decided what we think is a good way to teach D&D, but there's not really an extremely clean way that builds perfectly upon everything. So we're going to say some things that if you're following the series, don't track exactly, because we haven't exactly talked about actions, bonus actions, reactions, and stuff. I think you'll be able to follow along, but just note that in later videos, we will go over those things in detail. You didn't miss a video. That part may just be missing, but I think it'll be okay. You'll be able to follow me here. Spells will have noted in their descriptions, along with what they do and the components and everything else we've talked about so far. They will let you know what type of action they require. Often in combat, you're taking actions, and a spell often is an action. But some spells happen more quickly or in other instances. So a lot of spells that you're doing in combat are going to be your action. And it's an important rule that it's important to note that as a spellcaster, you can only cast one spell per round as long as the other spell is a cantrip. So even if you get some special thing where you can cast two spells, you're not able to do it. You can cast any cantrip and other spells, but not both at the same time. So some spells are also what's called a bonus action, and that allows you to do them on your turn as well as other things. Again, we'll get to some of the economy later, but these are things that maybe happen a little more quickly. You wouldn't be able to cast a spell that's an action and a spell that's a bonus action on the same turn, based on the things I just said. But separately, you could use your action to do something else in the world and do a bonus action. Another type of action that spells can use is what's called the reaction. This is something that you get to do when something happens to you. There are specific rules as to when and how many you can get, but some spells happen in that way if it's like a shield that comes up quickly, or it just works in different circumstances. Those rules we'll get to, but again, all of these things will be noted within the spells themselves. There are just those three general types: actions, bonus actions, and reactions that apply to spells.
It's worth adding too that the type of action that a spell requires is not something that you can change or go. So if a spell says that it takes a bonus action, you cannot use your action to cast it, or vice versa. That you basically have to follow the letter of the wording in terms of, if this spell says action, you can only, you can't use your bonus action to use it. You have to follow the specific wording. Or like even like a spell that says a reaction, you can only cast it when the exact circumstance that the spell says is met, not just whenever you want to. It'll be very specific in the spell itself, like what those conditions are as far as when and how you can use things like reaction spells. But just know that these are not things that you can like swap around unless a class feature very explicitly tells you that you can change it from like inaction to a bonus action or something like that, that they are like set in stone by the spell. So we've covered a lot of different ground as much as we can generally with spellcasting. Again, because it's also class specific in some certain instances, there's just some things that we couldn't quite cover for all the different classes. So like, especially like warlocks have certain ways that their spell slots work compared to different classes, and all those sorts of things. That'll all be in the book. We do plan on doing more character creation videos, like our last one where we made our dwarf fighter that we made in that last video. Obviously, we'll trim it way down so that we don't spend quite so much time explaining it. But specifically in the context of spellcasting, keep an eye out for when we do end up making, videos of us creating a warlock or creating a wizard or a cleric or these different things, because it's a lot easier to sort of see it in their own context and following the specific rules that the class says, as opposed to just the general spellcasting rules where there are so many caveats and so many what if that and what if this. So I just wanted to make a note that if we left any specific things out that are different about one class or another, that we will cover those individual intricacies when we actually make the characters that have those classes. and that there's just not time in a general video like this to cover every single use case of all the different things like that. So keep an eye out for those down the line when we end up getting to those.
All right, so that is spellcasting and magic. At least generally, you should have an understanding when you go to make your spellcaster. You should at least understand the general idea of how magic works, how you can use it in the game, and some of the rules. Like we said, just read the descriptions, really lean on the class descriptions as well as the spell descriptions for all these details. You don't have to memorize a lot of this stuff. We are Tabletop Terrors. We love fun, creativity, and of course, tabletop gaming. If you love those things as well, consider subscribing so that you'll see when we put out a new video each week. And if you hit the notification bell, you'll be sure to get that on your lock screen so you know when the video is up. As usual, we want to hear your comments. What are your spellcasting questions? Please let us know. And again, we will be doing more videos on creating spellcasters as well as combat. So, what didn't we answer? What still needs to be clearer? And let us know in the comments. Let's end with a Tabtarian toast.
May you mend the first break.
May you kill the first snake.
May you conquer everything you undertake.
Slancha.
So the truth is that for many years that I've been playing 5th edition, I haven't been following the actual rules of spellcasting. And there's evidence of this in recorded online games where I went back and realized that there are spells that I would use just the way that I imagined them working, not looking at their casting time, not looking at exactly how, what verbal somatic components. One such example is in the Provoker Season 1, I use, I can't remember the name of it. It's a paladin spell where you basically summon your mount. I think it's called Summon Mount. Read that spell. The way I used it is not the way it happened. I summoned my mount on top of someone as a defensive thing. I think it takes like 10 minutes to cast and is like this. It's not the way. I was like, Alec a horse. It was like in the narrative, like this horse or this ram. I think it was a ram.
He said Alec a horse, but it was a ram.
Drops on top of this guard, and I just thought, you know what? It was really fun. So,
Moral of the story is it's okay to cheat.
as long as it's fun.
As long as you say Alec a horse.
And that's not subjective.